Hello, my noble band of outlaws. Outlaw Samurai coming at you live with a video. I know, it's been a minute since I've actually made a new video. I've just mainly been uploading backlogs and making shorts. But for right now, I had a thought. As you know, I do intentionally intend to get my hands on a Chinese Jian sword. But at the moment, I don't have one. But I do have something that may be in overall shape a good proxy for one. And that is the cold steel Viking sword. Now I know what you're thinking, Outlaw. You've made some crazy ass comparisons before, but trying to compare the swift and nimble Jian to the crude, barbaric Viking sword. Well, yes, I'm going into that territory. Honestly, Viking swords and Jian, if you really pay attention, are not all that different. True, the Viking sword has a much more European aesthetic, but if you were to just take away these quillons and make this pommel fully teardrop shaped and put Samigawa ray skin on the grip, you would think that this would have been a very crudely made Chinese Jian. And it is double-edged like the Jian. Now, the reason being why I say this could be a good analog for a Jian is because a lot of the Han Dynasty Jian that are recovered from historical graves have blades that are about a foot or two longer than this, for one. And yes, they are lighter, like the LK Chen Flying Phoenix, I would presume would be about half the weight of this sword. But here's the thing, there also have been historically documented accounts of Jian being found in graves and even in private collections, antique Jian that have the dimensions and weight of Viking swords that sometimes weighed 2-3 pounds, and this is about a 2 or 3 pound sword. So it's not out of the realm of possibility for someone to transfer the Jian style over to a Viking sword. And honestly, I believe a Viking sword would be an even better training analog to use for Jian fighting than an actual Jian because of the way the weight is distributed. This sword's weight is more concentrated than a lot of the replica Jian that are out there. LK Chen has basically proven himself to be the standard of historically accurate Han, Tang, and Qin dynasty swords. And the Han dynasty Jian and Ming dynasty as well. I believe he offers swords from every dynasty up to the post-World War II era China as historical replicas. And because of that, you've just seen me demonstrate a few of the classic Jian styles of Jian fighting with this Viking sword very easily. Now, I am a relatively large guy. I have relatively big arms and relatively big hands and strong wrists. Because of my build, maneuvering this sword around like a Jian is much easier for me than if I was of a smaller build and less muscular. But because of the weight of this sword, I feel like swords like this would be a better training analog for a Jian, simply because of that weight, because the weight is more concentrated. Your wrist and hand will get a much better overall workout using this thing in place of a historical Jian, because the weight is more concentrated and thus requires more strength and more effort to perform the same kind of actions as you would with a Jian. Not that I would say that, go so far as to say that if the Vikings learned Kung Fu, they would basically be able to become Shaolin Vikings or something. No, this is at the end of the day a Scandinavian Viking. It's a Scandinavian sword. If we're being perfectly honest, this is an Anglo-Saxon. This is an Anglo-Saxon Scandinavian sword. If we're going to put real historical labels on it. And as I just demonstrated, you can perform the same kind of flourishes with this sword as you can a Jian. Now, there are two things that the Jian has that this sword doesn't. More evenly distributed weight and its size. What do I mean by that? Well, the historical Jian, like L.K. Chen's Flying Phoenix, which I really wish I had an example of, is basically a longsword sized blade, but it can be comfortably wielded one-handed without undue stress to the wielder. And that is because of how L.K. Chen forges his blades with their tapering and their and the distal taper that he gives them and the proportions of the sword itself. One of the good things about L.K. Chen's swords is that the Flying Phoenix has a period accurate grip. And while this Viking sword's grip may be a bit long for period standards, most Viking swords, the grip would only be about as wide as your hand itself. This grip is made longer to suit basically anyone who wants to pick this up and use it. Basically, if this sword was a military issued blade, it would be a pattern. And militaries, when they make weapons and when they made swords for combat, they had a pattern for this type, like a type 24, a type 23, a type 28. They would have patterns for these blades. This portion down, they would have this down to the centimeter. Whereas like this portion needs to have this much distal taper. This portion needs to be this wide. This part needs to be this thick. And working from a pattern makes forging the blades incredibly easier and go a lot faster, because you're basically just copying the same thing over and over again, which makes making them in mass easy. That's what modern reproductions do. They make a pattern, they make a prototype sword, they test it, they see what went wrong, they tweak it, they mass produce it, and then a few years later they're like, okay, these guys commented this, and this, and if they are uh, ones that care about their work and their product, they'll basically say, okay, so these are what they want changed. They want more distral taper here. They want the blade to be wider. They want it to have more curvature, less curvature, all these things. And if this was a military sword, it would be a pattern. But I got off track. But yeah, now I remember. So, the Han Dynasty Jian that LK Chen makes actually has a grip that could facilitate two-handed use. It's basically what a European would call a bastard sword. One hand or two-handed use. Now, if you know anything about Asian swords in general, be that Chinese swords, Korean swords, Japanese swords, all these different kinds of swords, Chinese swords, I think I mentioned that, they tend to have longer grips than what is needed for the blade. Katana, technically, the katana that we are used to by today's standards, those 27-inch blades are technically one-handed swords by the very length of blade that they possess. This is a bit, this is going just a hair into the bastard sword blade length category, in my opinion. I think this is like a 33-inch blade. 34-inch blades are what I would consider starting to go into bastard sword, and 40-inch blades are what I consider long sword. But yeah, and what this longer grip does for the weapon is that it acts as a counterbalance. In Chinese swords, there's the pommel that acts. The Chinese swords are similar to the European blades, where their pommels sometimes do act as counterbalances to the overall blade itself. The whole, like, the pommel and crossguard aren't counterbalancing, that is a myth. A pommel and crossguard are a counterbalance for the sword because they add weight by the hand. Even a hollow pommel will still technically be a counterbalance to the rest of the blade, because even if it's hollow, that's still weight at the end of the blade. Now, they didn't rely solely on the pommel to counterbalance the whole thing, or else the pommels would be so damn massive you wouldn't be able to use this thing properly. They used proper forging techniques, giving it distral taper, tapering the blade to make it easier to wield. And the Chinese did this as well. The Japanese and Korean swords also, these swords, they have longer grips to facilitate two-handed or one-handed use, but they are also counterbalancing the rest of the blade. Alright, with Japanese and Korean swords, or any saber-like blades from the Asiatic regions of the world, most of the counterbalance, from what I've seen on sword forums, they will tell you comes from the Suba handguard. And while I'm not disproving that, most of the swords today don't have the actual historically accurate size of a Suba that the old swords of Japan would have had. Most of the Suba that would be on, that come on the swords of today would actually be put on Wakazakis. Right? Historically accurate antique Suba were about 4 to 4.5 inches wide, and almost sometimes over a 1/4 inch thick. So they were big, thick, and heavy. Now, that's also because, well, they're supposed to be guarding your hands, and we don't generally fence with swords anymore. But just because of the fact that they were much bigger and much heavier, that's where the Suba, that's where the Suba counterbalances the sword thing comes from. In most modern day katanas, what actually counterbalances the blade is the whole weight of the fittings themselves. Everything from the habaki to the seba to the suba to the fushira, the kashira, the ito wrap, the suka core itself, the whole the whole bottom half of the fixtures are what counterbalances modern day swords, at least with the Japanese and Korean made swords, because Japanese and Korean swords are very similar in appearance. The major difference is how the blade is forged, and I won't get into that right now. The point of the matter is, and the point of this video, is that the Viking sword, the one from Cold Steel, or any Viking sword really, that has proportions similar to this, in my opinion, would make a very good analog for learning how to use the Jian. And then when you actually do pick up a historically accurate and historically weighted Jian, and you swing it around a little bit, you'll find that, oh, this is a lot easier and a lot more nimble to move around, because you have already built up the muscles needed to perform those techniques with the actual Jian from using the Viking sword. In any case, I hope that this video has been informative and that you were able to learn something from my ramblings. So until next time, my noble band of outlaws, Outlaw Samurai tells all y'all, be crazy rednecks, be safe and use your weapons, and I'm out. Peace. Huh. This actually was less than 20 minutes. Oh my god. I'm getting better at this. He says while still not stopping the video.